starting an experiment. I'm going to leave it for the night to see what kind of step sizes I can get. So the first step size is 1 second. So it turns on the actuator for 1 second. And meanwhile, it takes a ton of measurements from the inclinometer. And I'll have multiple generations. So generation 0 is 1 second. Generation 1 will reduce by 10 milliseconds. Generation 2 will reduce by another 10 milliseconds. So the step size will get shorter and shorter. And with the inclinometer, what's nice is I can go from 0 degrees to 43 degrees, which is my max here. And then I go back and then I increment generation. So let's see what kind of data I get. I'm writing everything to a big file. And then I'll analyze the data and we'll see what are good step sizes and how fast this. I'm mostly interested in how fast the measurements take place, because there's a little wobble. So I'm expecting the steps that are shorter to have less wobble and to be able to get measurements faster. So it means you could progress faster with shorter steps. But we'll see what the data says. Here I have the time series plotted for how the panel was extending. These are measurements of angles from the inclinometer. So on the y-axis I have angles. It goes from 0 to 40 degrees. So this was the very first experiment generation where it did a step size of 1 second. And the precision of the inclinometer is amazing. So if I zoom in here, so there's a couple steps that it's making. I'll make it a nicer zoom. Let's take several steps. And you can see that it after it wobbles, this is the shaking, and it then stops shaking. This is not random data. Even right here where there's flat lining, I can see little ups and downs. to me, this looks like the inclinometer is actually getting accurate measurements. It's just the environment that keeps shaking. So we're definitely within 1 degree here. If I zoom in more, this is the first thing that I was just amazed at. That here we're looking between 14 degrees and 15 degrees. So this is 1 degree. And even in here, you can discern between the slightest degree change. So this is between 14.4 and 14.5. This keeps kind of oscillating up and down. So I wonder if I average this out, then I'll be able to very accurately tell the angles if I need to go down to that accuracy. Now the second thing, which is really cool, you can see the physics, what's happening here. So this was when the reflector was stable and not shaking, and then I issue an actuator move for 1 second. It goes from 12 to 14, so it moves about 2 degrees in 1 second. Here's where it stops, and then when it stops, if you remember, it kind of goes like, and then it shakes and then it stabilizes. So that's when it stopped and then started shaking. There's this kind of a after effect reverberation after the stop. There's a sudden stop in the panel. The whole reflector starts shaking and then it stabilizes. So I'm gonna write a little program that captures how long it took for the shaking. So from here all the way to maybe here, I'll declare that the shake period, that's when we can't take measurements off of the wattage sensor, because the light will kind of be still shaking around the solar panel. But after this point, we can take it. So this is 1 second. The other data I have is half a second right here, a tenth of a second, so 100 milliseconds. 50 millisecond step size, and then finally 20 millisecond step size. You see the number of steps increases a lot. When I decrease the step size, there's going to be much more steps, and there's much more samples. Every time there's more steps, it takes a longer time. So let's look at 100 milliseconds. I can zoom in here. And there's definitely enough precision in an inclinometer to detect any of this. And the interesting part here is that there's still, so every step size is 1,000 samples that I collect from inclinometer. So it should, this whole range should be about the same amount of time for any of these charts. So you could see it kind of takes about 500 samples before it starts to settle down. So even if the step size is shorter, it still shakes about the same amount of time, which is kind of now makes sense now that I see this data. And even for a tiniest step size of 20 milliseconds, here's what it looks like. So kind of in the middle, at 20 degrees, it kind of becomes more stable and less shaky, but overall it's pretty shaky like this. If we zoom in to any one of these step sizes, the shorter step size seems to even cause more shaking that lasts longer. Maybe it's not as vigorous, because we're talking from 12.2 degrees to 12.8 degrees. It's less vigorous, but it's less amplitude, but it's actually even looks like more time that it's spent shaking. It just keeps vibrating until it gets more towards the end of the 1,000 samples. So yeah, this is fascinating. Let me try to aggregate this into more high-level view and try to make sense of it. Here I plot the step size of 1, which means the actuator is turned on for 1 second and then turned off, and then I wait for 1,000 samples of the inclinometer, and then I turn on for 1 second and turn it off. Keep going until we reach the final angle of 40 something degrees. So it starts here at 0 degrees, goes all the way to 40, and then retracts back to 0. So what I'm showing here is the different wobbliness of the inclinometer. So if we zoom in, you can see how much wobble there is. So it's actually hard to record it like this, but there. So if we look at the first step when we turned it on for 1 second, there was a lot of wobbliness, and then there was some stability. And I'm able to detect the stability by looking at the average mean, which you see here is a rolling average of the red line. And it's looking at the last 300 samples, and if the raw data deviates from this mean by more than 0.01 degrees, then I declare that this is too wobbly, and I mark it red. And then if it doesn't deviate, as you can see here, I can start zooming in like this. There. So this doesn't deviate by more than 0.01 degrees, so it's stable. So overall, step size of 1 second is really bad. There's almost no steps in the middle that had stability, maybe a tiny bit towards the end. Once it got to the outer edge of the angle, had a little bit of stability here, and interestingly during the retract did a little better, or more stabilities towards the end, closer to the position where the reflector is fully open. So then I charted different step sizes, and I just measured, instead of showing this raw data, I just measured how long this instability lasted. So it can be anywhere from 0 to 1,000. 1,000 samples, that means everything was unstable, and 0 means everything was stable. So here's what it looked like. So on the bottom I have this 1,000 milliseconds, which is 1 second data that I just showed you. See, it was on the extent, it was mostly unstable, it was hitting 1,000 for all the degrees, and on the retract it was a little more stable towards the lower degrees. But if you look at half a second, it done a little better, and 100 milliseconds was even a little more improvement. All the way up to 25 degrees, everything stabilized relatively quickly within just the first 10 samples or so. And then there's this sudden shift where everything becomes wobbly. Now if I go 20 milliseconds, there's lots of steps that it took, because there's very tiny steps. And yeah, here around 27, 28 degrees, becomes super wobbly again. So this is telling me that on the actuator it's too shaky, and maybe I need to decrease the voltage, make it softer. So I've implemented wobble detection, and it only moves once the wobble is not detected. So I have to stand very still for about 10 seconds and it'll move. There we go. But if I make a lot of ruckus and walk around, then I'll just keep waiting, taking samples off of the inclinometer I don't know if my voice is, yeah, my voice is not enough. But look, if I'm stepping around, it's not gonna move. And you can go over detection, but it's basically a moving average of the angles from the inclinometer. And if the angle is further away from the moving average, then I forgot my thresholds now. Then we keep doing the check, and then we want to find a continuous run of angles that were not far away from the moving average. And then if the moving average is also changing from the previous moving average too much, then we also call it off and say that there's a wobble. All right, not stomping anymore. Very still. Guess I was stomping a lot, and there's a lot of vibration. There we go. All right, so now it should be back to about every 10 seconds. The voice doesn't seem to cause it to. There we go. Put together all the data into this one heat map. So the experiment ran overnight, and it tried all the step sizes anywhere from 1 second and all the way down to 40 milliseconds. And so on the y-axis, you see the different step sizes. And through each step size, what I did was I had the panel go from 0 degrees all the way to 38 degrees. So this is just showing the extension part. I also have another data set for the retraction. But as far as the extension goes, you could see there's the black is good. So the axis here means that close to 0 time was spent in the wobbling phase. So there's almost no time that the panel was shaking. And when you get to this, on the other spectrum, this kind of pinkish color, or I guess cream color, is really bad. That means the panel was shaking for a long time, and I had to wait for a long time for it to just settle down. The gray boxes you can ignore. It basically means that we didn't have data for all the angles, because as you can imagine, at larger step sizes, we're kind of jumping over different degrees. We're not going to get every single degree, but anywhere starting from 400 milliseconds, we get this consistent data without the gray squares. That means we're covering every single degree. So the conclusion is that, first of all, that anything above 24 degrees is going to be really bad. So there's going to be a lot of shaking. And this is very consistent with what I've seen. This is the sunset part, the actual very important part where the panel starts to make gains during the sunset, and the reflector is catching a lot of that sunlight. But as you could see, the reflector is very wobbly, and I think this explains a lot of the issues that I've been having with trying to localize the reflector. So yeah, that's about 25 degrees. There's looks like there's not much I can do in terms of changing the step size. But I do have a simple solution. I think I can reduce the voltage on the actuator, and it'll be much more gentle and move the panel softly and not cause so much shaking. But there's also an interesting kind of secondary observation in terms of step size, is that around 600 milliseconds and lower, it gets much better. So you get this really black meaning that there's not much shaking going on after 600 milliseconds. So I think I'll have my step sizes go from 600 and lower. I am gonna run an experiment with very low numbers, but below 40 milliseconds. Because there's does seem to be something interesting starting going on there. But of course, with those tiny step sizes, it's very hard to do a scan. It just take forever and many, thousands of steps that you have to take. I am running another experiment right now that looks into this area. So I kind of had a cutoff. If you wait for too long, I just kind of stop waiting and go to the next step. But I implemented detection of wobble end. So when the wobble has ended, I can then resume the operation of the reflector. So it actually is not going to affect the correctness anymore, because I'm just going to wait till it stops wobbling. And it's pretty cool because you can, if you're like moving around, it won't move, but if you become still, then it will proceed. And the experiment will show what's going on here, so maybe there's a more gradual change. But yeah, it'll be interesting to see this and what happens below 40 milliseconds. All right, now let's look at the retraction, because this was the extend. Retraction data looks very similar. There's also something interesting that starts to happen at very small step sizes, below 80 milliseconds. But yeah, overall, it's retract and extend are very similar.